So, tell me what you got.
Well, the CIA cooked up this elaborate scheme which started back in the 1940s to bring up two unrelated boys, Harvey and Lee, in the hope that when they grew up, they would turn out to look alike, so that one of them, who was chosen because he was able to speak Russian like a native, could be sent into the Soviet Union as a spy.
It sounds a bit unlikely, to be honest.
There's more to it than that. When the plot to assassinate JFK was being planned, the plotters decided to take one of the unrelated identical twins and frame him for the murder. One of the two Oswalds, Lee, was given the task of framing the other one, Harvey.
The people who organized this two Oswald scheme were the same ones who killed President Kennedy?
Oh, yes.
What documentary evidence do you have for that? If I'm going to persuade my editor to run this story, we'll need to see some documents.
Well, it was top secret, you know. All of the documents will have been destroyed.
That's unfortunate. Now, what happened to the other unrelated identical twin, the one who wasn't framed? What has he been doing since 1963?
We're not quite sure. He seems to have vanished into thin air immediately after the assassination.
I see. On the subject of Oswald's defection, I believe that several other Americans defected to the Soviet Union around the time Oswald went there. I guess that some of them might have been U.S. agents too. How many of them had unrelated identical twins?
I don't think any of them did.
So this particular spy was the only one to have an unrelated identical twin. Why was that?
Ah, good point. I'm not entirely sure, but it's an exciting idea, isn't it? It means there was this really, really big conspiracy. Doesn't that get you all excited?
Personally, no. I'm curious about what you were saying about one of the two boys being a native speaker of Russian. How did that come about?
He was a Hungarian refugee. You see, Hungarian is a funny sounding foreign language, and so is Russian. Just listen to them, they both sound really weird, like gibberish. Don't forget that Hungary and Russia are both over there in Europe or someplace. So if the boy spoke Hungarian, he must have also been able to speak Russian. And then when he came back to the US, he immediately learned English too. The reason we know that this is because he was in school in New York, age 12, speaking English.
I see. This boy's first language was Hungarian, and then he learned to speak Russian like a native, and then he learned to speak English like a native. You're saying that by the age of 12, he was, in effect, a native speaker of three very different languages. Is that right?
Exactly.
What was the Hungarian boy's name? Are there any official documents identifying him? There must be something from when he entered the U.S. Do you have any copies that I can show my editor?
Look, will you stop trying to complicate things? Okay, so maybe the Russian speaking boy wasn't Hungarian after all. He was, probably a Russian World War II orphan instead. That's right, he was a Russian World War II orphan.
Oh, I see. And the evidence for that is?
Please stop asking all these unhelpful questions. There aren't any immigration papers or anything like that. It's obvious that all the documents were destroyed by the people behind the two Oswald plot. Look, our theory requires one of the Oswald boys to have been a native speaker of Russian. So that boy must have been a Hungarian refugee or a Russian orphan or something. It doesn't matter that there's no evidence for any of this. Our theory requires it, so it must be true.
What was the point of the defector being able to speak Russian like a native?
That was so he could overhear things without the Soviet authorities suspecting that he was a spy.
But Oswald didn't speak Russian like a native.
Yes, he did. It says so in my holy book.
He seems to have spoken the language quite well, at least by the time he arrived back in the U.S., but that doesn't mean that he was a native speaker of Russian.
Yes, it does.
Several witnesses, including Marina Oswald, said that his knowledge of Russian grammar really wasn't very good. That pretty much proves that he wasn't a native speaker.
Don't listen to them. They're lying.
Okay. Anyway, we've got two unrelated boys who grew up to look identical. My editor might find that a bit hard to believe. Could I have copies of any photographs which show the two boys together?
Well, there aren't any photographs of boys together. That would have given away the plot, you see.
So there's no actual photographic evidence?
Oh, yes, we've got plenty of photographs of each Oswald. All you need to do is line them up and compare them.
Really? You can tell which Oswald is which?
Of course. I mean, none of us agrees exactly on which photographs are of which Oswald. There's a fair amount of guesswork involved, obviously.
Why is that?
Well, all the photographs look as though they are of the same person. Or they would if you didn't know about the two Oswald plot. You see, we all agree that there's a big conspiracy going on here, so if you examine the photographs carefully and you want to see that they look a bit different, they do. You just need to keep an open mind and consider all the possibilities.
So how do you tell which photograph is of which Oswald?
Okay, for example, there are a couple of photographs which show Oswald with sloping shoulders. That means one of the Oswalds had sloping shoulders and the other one didn't.
So all the photographs of this particular Oswald show him with sloping shoulders?
Actually, no. We had to allocate some of the non-sloping shoulder photographs to the sloping shouldered Oswald. You see, our holy book tells us where each Oswald was at any particular time. So all you have to do is to work out where and when each photograph was taken, and that tells you which Oswald it is.
I guess the sloping shoulders thing wasn't a permanent feature then. It was just how he happened to be standing when the picture was taken.
I hadn't thought of that. Okay, forget the sloping shoulders. How about this one instead? One of the Oswalds was photographed in his Marine uniform, and he looks beefier than the scrawny Oswald who features in photographs taken at other times. This proves that he was two people.
Well,
And in some of the photographs, he even has a different haircut. What more evidence could you possibly need?
surely all the apparent differences can be explained by factors such as different lighting conditions, different poses, Oswald getting older, bulking up while in the Marines, that sort of thing.
No, not at all. That's too far-fetched. You see, if you can imagine that all of these differences are actually due to something much more believable, such as a really enormous plot, everything becomes so much more exciting. Don't you get a tingly feeling when you think that everything in the world is under the control of some super powerful bad guys? I do.
What about the mothers of these two Oswalds? Did they look similar too?
Yes, and they were both called Marguerite.
That's handy.
Actually, they look sort of similar but different at the same time, just like their sons. You see, there are photographs of one of the Marguerites taken a few decades before the assassination, and she looks young and slim and attractive. But the other Marguerite, who was photographed a few decades later, looks heavier, gray-haired, and generally older. That proves she was a different person.
Is that it? Just photographs?
No, not at all. There is one rock-solid piece of evidence that proves beyond any doubt that there were two Marguerites. Some guy who met her on one occasion in the 1950s was shown a photograph of her about 40 years later, and he thought that woman in the photograph looked a bit different to the one he remembered.
You're saying that he met her once and he was shown a photograph of her 40 years later and he thought she looked a bit different?
Exactly. You can't argue with that, can you?
Let me get this straight. You got two pairs of people, two Oswalds and two Marguerites, and they look sort of similar but different?
That's right.
What about their friends and relatives? Didn't they spot that each boy looked a bit different or that each Marguerite looked a bit different?
Oh no, because the two boys looked identical and the two mothers looked identical.
I thought you said that they weren't identical, that you can glance at the photographs and tell which is which.
That's right, each boy looked identical enough to fool his friends and family, but different enough so that we can tell them apart when looking at photographs. Well, at least some of the time. Same for the Marguerites. It was a very cunning plan.
I was wondering about Oswald's older brother Robert, who I think is still alive. Are there two of him, or just the one?
I'll have to consult my holy book, but I think we believe there has only been one of him.
So he was the actual brother of one of your two Oswalds and the actual son of one of your two Marguerites. Is that right? Did he ever meet the other Oswald and Marguerite?
As it happens, he did. According to our holy book, Robert grew up knowing his real brother and mother, of course, but at some point in the 1950s, they were replaced by the other brother and mother without him noticing. Or if he did notice, he was bribed or tortured so that he wouldn't spill the beans. And Robert's wife knew both Marguerites, and she kept quiet about it too.
I find it difficult to believe that Robert and his wife never went public with this information.
That just shows you how well organized the plot was.
There must have been plenty of people who had known Marguerite for years. Did any of them come forward to point out that the woman on TV after the assassination wasn't the woman they had known?
Of course not. Do you really think that the people behind the Oswald project weren't able to twist a few arms when necessary?
I understand that there are a couple of people who specifically stated that the Marguerite they saw after the assassination was the same woman they had known years earlier. How do you explain that?
They were bribed. They may have been even tortured. Isn't it obvious?
Not to me, I'm afraid.
Okay, forget about that then. There's also Oswald's handwriting. It looks sort of different sometimes.
I thought that the House Select Committee on Assassinations got some experts in to look at that, and they found that all the handwriting was of one person.
Ha! Do you really think those so-called experts weren't bribed or tortured? You're so naive.
The way I see it, you've got problems with the photographs, which aren't clearly of two different people, and with the handwriting, which the experts say was done by just one person. My editor isn't going to be persuaded by that. Are there any other types of evidence that might show that there were two Oswalds?
I was thinking of Oswald's shoes.
His shoes?
Yes, you see, if you examine Oswald's shoes, you might find different patterns of wear and tear on the soles, which would prove beyond any doubt that he was two people.
Right. How many pairs of his shoes have you examined?
Well, we haven't actually got a hold of Oswald's shoes yet, but it's a possible line of research.
What if the shoes don't show different patterns of wear and tear?
That proves the shoes were faked.
I see. And what if you can't actually get a hold of any of his shoes?
That proves that the shoes were deliberately destroyed by the gang of super powerful bad guys who set up the Oswald project. If the shoe thing doesn't work, there's always his underpants, although I wouldn't be surprised if they've been deliberately destroyed too.
Okay. On the subject of the two Marguerites, what happened to the other one after the assassination? What has she been doing since 1963?
She vanished into thin air.
Just like her son?
Exactly. Or it might have been the other Marguerite's son who vanished. I'll have to check the holy book. But getting people to vanish like that, it just shows you how sophisticated and believable the plot was, doesn't it?
Now, I presume that your theory takes events in the actual Lee Harvey Oswald's life and attributes them to one or other of the two Oswalds, either Harvey or Lee.
That's right.
What happened to the Oswald who had undergone a mastoidectomy operation at the age of 6? Was he the one who defected to the Soviet Union, then came back to the U.S., got a job at the Texas School Book Depository, and was shot by Jack Ruby?
No, that was the other one.
You're sure about that?
Absolutely. It says so in our holy book.
So the Oswald who was buried in Fort Worth was not the Oswald who had undergone the mastoidectomy operation?
That's right. It's all carefully set out in our holy book.
But when the body in that grave was exhumed in 1981, it was found to have a bone defect that was consistent with having been caused by a mastectomy operation. Doesn't that fact alone completely invalidate your theory?
Oh no, because our theory didn't exist then. Our holy book wasn't written until about 20 years later.
So your theory was conclusively refuted 2 decades before it was even published. That's quite an achievement.
We'd prefer not to think about that, thank you.
I'm not surprised.
If you look at things in the right way and have a mind open enough to consider all the possibilities, there's always an answer. In the case of the mastectomy operation, it's obvious that the scientists who performed the exhumation were bribed or tortured.
Really? Can you show me some evidence for that?
Will you stop with all this evidence nonsense? Okay, so perhaps the scientists weren't bribed or tortured. Something else obviously happened. I know. Their report was faked.
Wasn't it published in a reputable scientific journal?
Ha, you're so naive. Prove to me that it wasn't faked. Go on. You can't, can you? The FBI and CIA were faking documents all the time. You just have to look at the evidence in the right way with an open mind.
If you say so.
Look, if the scientists weren't bribed or tortured, and if their report wasn't faked, it stands to reason that the other Oswald boy must have been operated on at the age of 6, just like the first Oswald. That has to be the reason why the body in Oswald's grave had the mastectomy defect.
Let me get this straight. The people who set up your Oswald project had a mastectomy operation performed on a 6-year-old boy back in the 1940s, just in case his body might need to be dug up decades later. Is that what you're saying?
It makes perfect sense to me. They thought of everything, those plotters.
I'm just wondering where this operation would have been carried out. Do you have the name of the hospital? The surgeon? My editor will need to see some documentation for all this. Can you get me photocopies of the records?
The operation was top secret, of course, so there won't be any records. I think it was carried out in a hospital in New York. That's another thing. According to the so-called official documentation, that hospital wasn't even built until several years after the operation must have taken place. This just proves that all the records have been faked or destroyed by the lizard people, and how top secret the whole thing was.
Uh-huh.
I mean, just ask yourself why there's virtually no documentary evidence for the existence of our two Oswalds. There ought to be absolutely loads of evidence, with 2 Oswalds and 2 Marguerites living separate lives for many years. But there's hardly any. The obvious answer is a vast amount of evidence has been faked or destroyed. It stands to reason when you think about it logically with an open mind and consider all the possibilities.
Right. Now, on the subject of living separate lives, are there any examples of the 2 Oswalds being in different places at the same time?
Indeed, there are. When he was a boy, he attended 2 schools at the same time. A few years later, when he was in the Marines, he was in Taiwan and Japan at the same time. Then, when one of the Oswalds was in the Soviet Union, the other one was in New Orleans trying to buy trucks.
That doesn't sound very likely. I presume you've got some really solid evidence to support these claims.
Well, we've got some eyewitnesses, and there's documentary evidence too. It's all on bits of paper and everything. Obviously, you need to know how to interpret the documents correctly.
Eyewitnesses often aren't very reliable. What method do you use to tell which witnesses are reliable and which ones aren't?
It's all about whether what they say agrees with our theory. We know that our theory is true, so that's how you can tell which witnesses are reliable and which ones aren't.
I presume all the documentary evidence could be interpreted in more than one way. I'd guess that your interpretation isn't the only one available.
You see, some people will try to dismiss our claims by saying that we're just cherry picking and deliberately misinterpreting stuff, are reading too much into simple clerical errors, but they're wrong. We know the truth.
I noticed that you described this 2 Oswald plan as the Oswald Project. Is there any evidence that that term was used officially?
Yes, there is. There was a former CIA guy who testified to the House Select Committee on Assassinations about Oswald, and he used the term Oswald Project.
Really? That's interesting. What did he say about this long term plan that involved 2 Oswalds and 2 Marguerites?
Well, on the face of it, when he used the term Oswald Project, he was just referring to Oswald's defection being a CIA operation, but we prefer to think that he was referring to the truth which is revealed to us in our holy book.
Did he say anything specific about this plot with the 2 Oswalds and the 2 Marguerites?
He might have done.
I'm sorry?
He might have said something.
Did he specifically mention this plot with the 2 Oswalds and the 2 Marguerites? Yes or no?
No.
So it's more than a little misleading to use a CIA guy as support for your 2 Oswald theory, isn't it?
But that's all we've got.
Hmm.
Look, you just can't claim that Oswald was an agent of some sort. That isn't particularly exciting. We think it's much better to get people to think that if Oswald was an agent, he was also the product of our Oswald Project. You see, the more complicated and unlikely something is, the more exciting it is. And this is really, really unlikely, which means it's very exciting indeed.
There's something else I was wondering about. There must be thousands of people around the world with a serious interest in the JFK assassination. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands. How many of them have you managed to convert?
It must be close to a dozen by now.
As many as that?
Well, we've only been going for a couple of decades, you know.
If you think about how many really gullible people there are, people with virtually no critical thinking skills at all, who are prepared to believe anything, no matter how far-fetched, that Elvis Presley arrived on Earth in an alien spaceship, that sort of thing. It looks as though even those people find your 2 Oswalds and 2 Marguerites theory too implausible for their tastes.
That's certainly our target audience, but they obviously haven't heard the word of truth yet. Or if they have, they aren't looking at the evidence in the right way, logically and with an open mind. We need to spread the word more efficiently. That's why we've come to you. You can give us the publicity we need.
If your theory has almost no support in JFK assassination circles, it must attract a fair amount of criticism.
COINTELPRO, lone nutters. COINTELPRO, lone nutters.
You think everyone with doubts about your theory is a supporter of the official line that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy alone and unaided?
Of course they are. Why else would they oppose the truth? Isn't it obvious?
You know, one of the standard ways in which the media dismisses criticism of the lone nut theory is to paint every critic of the official line as a paranoid, moon landings crazy fantasist. What about those people who say that all of these overcomplicated super conspiracy theories are exactly what the media needs, and that far-fetched, poorly supported theories like yours just bring rational criticism of the lone nut theory into disrepute?
COINTELPRO, lone nutters. COINTELPRO, lone nutters. COINTELPRO, lone nutters.
Okay, calm down. I was wondering how you deal with all that criticism.
Usually it's best to ignore it and hope it goes away. You see, from time to time, some COINTELPRO lone nutter will demonstrate how this or that aspect of our theory is wrong. When that happens, we will simply change the subject. Then, later on, once everyone's attention has been diverted, we can bring up the same aspect of our theory again, completely ignoring the objections that the COINTELPRO lone nutter brought up the last time around.
Really?
Oh, yes. Very often, we'll just copy and paste the stuff that has been disproved and pretend that it hasn't been. Copy and paste, copy and paste. We can do this over and over again.
That doesn't seem very honest to me. Won't people see through that tactic?
Unfortunately, they do, yes. Another way to divert attention from criticism is to quote long passages from our holy book.
If you were serious, if you weren't afraid of being proved wrong, surely you'd be happy to deal with criticism of your theory.
I suppose so. There's an online forum based in Australia that gives our theory a hard time. If we weren't afraid of being proved wrong, I suppose we could join that forum and deal with its members' questions honestly.
I think you should do that. Why don't you?
Mainly because that forum is full of rude people who use naughty words and we're easily offended. Oh, and there's also the possibility that our theory wouldn't last 5 seconds and we'd become a laughing stock.
But you are already. Your theory was debunked by solid scientific evidence 2 decades before it was even published. As laughing stocks go, you're world champions.
Please don't say that. I really want to believe my theory. It makes me feel better about myself.
Yes, I was wondering why you are so attracted to an idea which most people would dismiss as far out paranoid nonsense.
You see, this belief in a super powerful conspiracy fills a certain psychological need in us. That's the reason we are incapable of questioning the truth that's revealed to us in our holy book. And if you believe in something strongly enough, you'll do whatever it takes to spread the word.
I'm curious about exactly what your theory has to say about the assassination itself.
Oh, nothing at all.
I mean, how does it relate to the strength or weakness of the evidence against Oswald, or the question of how many shots were fired, or whether it was physically possible for one person to have fired all the shots?
Who cares about any of that? This is about thinking up the biggest conspiracy ever. You see, the bigger the conspiracy, the more likely it is that President Kennedy was killed as a result of a conspiracy.
But surely any conspiracy only needed to be large enough to kill JFK and maybe to frame Oswald. There's no need for anything larger.
I hadn't thought of it like that.
It really isn't necessary for the conspirators to have the power to create an extra Oswald and Marguerite, or to have the power to alter all the films and photographs, or to have the power to kidnap Kennedy's corpse without anyone noticing, or any of those other way out ideas. The more elaborate the conspiracy theory you're proposing, the less likely it is to be true, wouldn't you say?
COINTELPRO, lone nutter. COINTELPRO, lone nutter.
Let's wipe all that foam from around your mouth. That's better.
Thank you. Look, it's like I was saying about Oswald being an intelligence agent. If there was really an elaborate scheme, a top secret conspiracy that went on for nearly 2 decades in which Oswald and an unrelated boy were controlled from the age 6, that's even stronger evidence that he was an intelligence agent.
I think it's widely accepted that Oswald had some sort of connection with one or another U.S. intelligence agency. Surely all that extra complication in your theory, the 6-year-old boys and the 2 Marguerites and the top secret unnecessary mastectomy operation in a hospital that hadn't been built yet, actually serves to discredit this idea, to make the idea seem much less plausible. Also, it makes you look like a bunch of crazies.
COINTELPRO, lone nutter.
What I mean to say is, if the general public finds out about your theory and people start to think that the only way to question the lone nut theory is to believe some crazy sounding stuff about Oswald being cloned at the age of 6, and that there were 2 Marguerites running around, and all the rest of it, and if they realize that there's essentially no solid evidence to support any of it, won't they tend to dismiss the whole idea that there's something wrong with the lone nut explanation?
Who cares what the general public thinks?
The only way the Kennedy case will ever be properly investigated is if the general public forces the authorities to do so. For as long as the public can be kept quiet, nothing will happen. From the point of view of the authorities, the general public needs to be neutralized. Your theory is exactly the sort of thing that the authorities would like the general public to associate with the JFK assassination.
We don't care about any of that. Look, Getting the Kennedy case properly investigated, finding out how it all really happened, doing some serious analysis of how the assassination relates to the functioning of the U.S. political system, all that nonsense, that's not what we're interested in. Our holy book gives us what we want, a really enormous conspiracy to believe in. It gets me all tingly.
You know, a lot of people suspect that you and similar far out conspiracy theorists are deliberately trying to undermine genuine criticism of the official line. If I were in charge of undermining genuine criticism, the first thing I'd do is to fabricate as many far out super conspiracy theories as I could think of. Then I'd get my friends in the press to report those theories instead of more credible objections to the official line.
No, no. I understand why people feel like that, but we really do believe what we're saying. The world is really run by a great shadowy conspiracy of super powerful bad guys. That's how the world works. There really were two Oswalds and two Marguerites, and two mastodectomy operations.
Okay, I see it's getting late, and I really need to.
So, are you going to put our story on the front page or in a big TV special?
Hmm, well, I'll have a word with my editor. I'll let you know.
Great. Going back to what you were saying about Elvis and alien spaceships, do you want to hear my theory about the so called moon landings?